Hello and welcome to my channel A Monk in Cloud. I am Yashwant and I'm thrilled to have you here. Be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a video. And don't forget to leave a comment to let me know what you think. Thank you for joining me on this journey and I can't wait to share more with you. Let's get started. Alright, now let's discuss about IAM. AWS IAM, that is Identity and Access Management, is a service provided by Amazon Web Services that allows you to manage user access to your AWS resources. So it will help you organize your users, roles, and attach some policies. For example, if you want a user to only access a particular resource, you can assign a certain policy to that user, and so that user will be able to access only that particular resource. Okay, so those things you can do under IAM. In simple terms, it allows you to create and manage users and groups and control what resources they can access and what actions they can perform on those resources. With IAM, you can also set up security policies and permissions that determine who can access your resources under what conditions. So this allows you to grant or restrict access to specific AWS resources such as S3 buckets, EC2 instances, and more. IAM is important for securing your AWS environment and ensuring that only authorized users have access to your resources. Now let's talk about the root user. So the AWS root user is an initial user who creates the account, or it is created when you sign up for an AWS account. So this user has got complete access to all the AWS services and resources in an account and has full administrative privileges, which means they can create, modify, or even delete any resources in the account, right? So when you sign up for an AWS account, the first username or your email address and the password that you give, so that will be your root account. And a root account has got full privileges, administrative access. That means you cannot deny anything from the root user. A root user is even able to delete the entire account. So it is always recommended not to use a root user. As soon as you create a root user, go ahead and create a user or a role for yourself, right? And then start using that user or role. Because if you go ahead and use root user, sometimes if you make any mistake, it will be a serious problem for you, right? And also set up multi-factor authentication for root user. So if you want me to make a video on multi-factor authentication, so let me know in the comments section. Okay, next let's move to the second point. As the root user, you have access to sensitive information such as billing details, security credentials, and the ability to change account level settings. It's important to secure your root user account and use it only when necessary. So you root user has got access to your billing information. You can get the billing information of your account, how much you have consumed. You can get the security report for your account. All those things you will be able to get as a root user. But if you are using an administrator user or a normal user, you won't have that permission. If you see right now, I've logged in as a normal user. It is not my root user credential. So if you see here, I'm getting an error saying that you need permission for doing this, or you need permission to access this. But as a root user, you will be having full access to this. Okay, so that is the second point. AWS recommends that you create an IAM user with administrative permissions and use instead of root user for day-to-day tasks. I have even mentioned this one. As soon as you create a root user, go ahead and create a new user and start using that for your day-to-day tasks. Okay, so this is the best practice to follow. as it reduces the risk of accidental changes to your AWS environment, and it also improves the security by limiting access to the root user account. Okay. Additionally, users using IAM users allow you to audit and monitor access and actions performed within your AWS account, so making it easier to track and troubleshoot issues. Okay, if you're going with a root account, if you make any mistake, you won't be able to identify who made what mistake there. But if you have users, different users, right, so you will understand by going through the credential report, or you can go through the logs, then you can see who made what mistake there, right? You can go and check the logs, right? So that is another concept which we will be going through in the coming sessions, but it is easier to identify, and it will be improves the security by limiting access to the user account also. The root user is similar to the concept of Unix root or Windows administrator user, right? It has full privileges to do anything in the account, including closing the account. So I mentioned this very importantly, because if you make any mistake, if you unfortunately delete or close the account, then everything will be gone. So be careful while using your root account. So the root user can be used for both console and programmatic access to AWS. Now, whatever you are seeing, this is AWS console. But if you want to go through your, programmatic access, I will show you how to access AWS console programmatically also in the coming lectures. So you can do that. Root user has full privilege, and he can do whatever he or she wants in the particular AWS account, right? So that's about AWS root user. In the next lesson, we'll see what are IAM users. Okay, now let's talk about IAM users, Identity Access Management users. Okay, IAM users are similar to normal users in Linux. This user can interact with the console and also use the command line interface. I'll show how to create a user and how to use CLI with the IAM users. Okay, so hold on till then. Now let's see what is the second point. AWS IAM users are identities that you create within AWS Identity and Access Management, and that you can use to interact with AWS services and resources. I'll show you how to do that in a while. In simple terms, IAM users are the accounts you create to grant access to individuals or applications that need to interact with your AWS resources. Each user has a unique set of security credentials. Basically, it will have something called as access key ID and the secret access key. So every user will have their own access key ID and the secret access key. We'll show you how to create that also. That are used to authenticate the user and authorize access to the resources. Okay. With IAM users, you can grant permissions to access specific AWS resources or actions within those resources. You can also set up multi-factor authentication, that is MFA, and password policies to enforce security and reduce the risk of unauthorized access. So basically, when you create an IAM user, so add an extra level of security by having multi-factor authentication. Basically, whenever you order something, or whenever, let's say you for example, if you're working in a corporate environment, let's say when you log into your laptop, it will ask for a code, right? You'll enter a 6-digit code, and only then you will be able to access your laptop or your desktop or your work computer, right? In the same way, it is acting as an extra layer of security, right? So even though you mention your username, password, you are entering the code which gets into your phone. So that is an extra level of security that you are providing. So those things also you can add for IAM users. IAM users can be organized into groups, which makes it easier to manage access permissions for a set of users with similar requirements. Let's say we have two person with A and B. right? So let's assume A and B are two people and they are administrators of my account. So this is my account and I want two administrators to manage this account. So the first person is A and the second person is B. So instead of creating, as two different users and assigning separate policies for them, what I can do is I can create a group and assign a common policy for that group, and once I add users into that group, they will inherit the property of that, right? So they will inherit whatever the policy that I've added into that group, so they will be using that group policy and able to access or do whatever the role that I assign to them. Okay, so that's about group, right? I'll talk about separately on groups. Wait till then, but now let's complete the IAM users. Okay, so using IAM users is a recommended best practice in AWS, as it helps you to control and manage access to your AWS resources in a granular and secure way. It also provides an audit trail of actions performed by each user, which helps with compliance and troubleshooting. So basically, it will give you an audit trail where you can go and see what user is doing what. So which user is performing what actions in our AWS account, whether he is deleting an EC2 instance or creating an EC2 instance, what he is doing. You can analyze by going through the audit logs and you can troubleshoot further. Okay, so we can create a maximum of 5,000 users in a single AWS account. Okay, now let's go back to the AWS management console. All right, now let's go ahead and create an IAM user in the management console. Okay, so this is my AWS management console. I've logged in as my administrator credentials. Okay, now let's go ahead and create a new user. To do that, you can search for IAM here in the search bar. Okay, and click on open IAM user and open it in a new tab. Okay, so after opening the IAM management console, you will have something called as users, groups, and roles in the left hand side. You see here you have user groups, users, roles, policies, and all those things. Now we are pertaining only to users. Let me click on users here. You see I have 3 users in my account already created. Okay, let's create a new user with the name demo user. Okay, so I'll go ahead, click on add user. You can specify the username as demo-user. In your case, it can be anything. I'm just going with demo user. And I want this user to have the management console access, meaning he should be able to log into AWS management console just like I have done here. Okay, I'll provide that access. I'll check this box and I want to create an IAM user, not the identity center. So that is a different one and I'll go with this one. I want to create an IAM user. Okay, next. So you need to provide a password for that. So we have provided the username and at the same time you also need to provide a password. So whether are you going with a auto generated password or you are going with a custom password, you can select this one. So whatever you want you can specify here. I'm going with a password here. Okay, so if you want you can verify that by clicking on the show password. Okay, so here if you see there is another option called users must create a new password at the next sign in. So if you want you can check that box. Whenever a user logs in with this password, he or she should be able to create a new password by providing the old password. If you want you can enable that. I'll disable that for this user. I'll uncheck this box and I'll click on next. Here what you can do is you can attach a policy directly, or you can add this user to a group. If you want to create a group of administrators, you can create a group of administrator and you can add this user into that group. Okay, so here what I'm going to do is I'll attach a policy directly. So I'll click on attach policy directly. Here I'm going to select administrator access. Be sure to while you are selecting this administrator access, be sure that you know what administrator access will provide. Basically administrator access will provide all the access, delete, create, and modify access to the user. Okay, so he can do whatever he wants in this particular AWS account. Okay, so I'll just select that one and I'll click on next here. Here, if you see, it will provide the summary of whatever you have given here, the username, the password, and all those things. If you want, you can add a tag here. So tagging will help you to identify your AWS resources or search for resources easily, and it will also help you in billing consolidation. Okay, so you can do that. I'll click on create users directly. Okay, here it will provide you the details. So here, if you see whatever the console sign in URL, so he or she can use this URL to log in. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll just copy this one and I'll paste that. I'll open a new incognito window and I'll paste this URL here, and let me sign into my AWS account with a new user that I'm creating. Okay, so don't use the same browser, or go ahead and use the incognito window so that you will be able to log in as a new user. Okay, so I'll copy this username also. I'll come back to my incognito browser here. I'll paste the username and the password. If you remember the password, you can use the password, or else I'll copy it directly from here and I'll paste the password here. Okay, I'll click on sign in now, and I should be able to log in as a new user to my AWS account. Here, if you see, whatever the name that you gave, I gave demo user, and this is appearing here, right? So you can create whatever you want, whichever resources you want, you can go ahead and create it here. Okay, so let me go back to my account here, my parent account here, and once you close this one, you will not be able to get these details. So you can, the password and all, if you don't remember, you can just copy it and save it with you. Okay, so I'll just return to the user list. If you see here, continue without viewing or downloading the console password. If you see here, it is saying that if you go ahead and do it, you won't be able to view it again. Okay, I'm okay with that. I'll click on continue. Here, if you see, previously I had only 3 users. Now I am also able to see one more user that I just created. Okay, so this is how you can create a user in your IAM management console. All right. So now we have created a user, and I have showed you how you can log into that user in your incognito browser. Now let's see how you can log into AWS using a CLI, right? So let's do something called as you need to have something called as AWS CLI installed on your machine. So if you do not know, I have made a separate video on that. It is available on my channel. Please go and check that out. Okay, now let's create something called as security credentials for this user. Okay, I'll go inside this user, and this is a AWS ARN, that is Amazon resource number, and that is what you are seeing here, and it is saying enabled without multi-factor authentication. So whenever you create a resource or whenever you create a new user, it is always recommended to go with multi-factor authentication also. Okay, now if you see here, this is the permission that we had given. Now let's go to the security credentials here. You see the console sign-in page which we had already taken, right? Now if you see here, we don't have the access key. So I spoke about this access key here in the theory. So I showed you that you have something called as access key and secret access key. Okay, now let's go ahead and create that. And by using this key, let's try and access our AWS console. Okay, so to do that, we'll go here and click on create access key. So what is that you are using this access key for? So it can be for command line interface, local code, it can be for application. So in my situation right now, I'm going to use this for command line interface. So I'll select that one and I'll click on next. So you need to understand and check this box before creating it. So I'll have checked that box. Now click on next. So whatever you want, the description, you can provide it here. CLI test, I'll just say CLI test or demo. I'll click on create access key. Here, if you see, it is giving you the access key and secret key. So it is always recommended not to share these keys with any of the users, or even if you're with your friends, because if they have these keys with them, they can do whatever they want. Now you might ask me, why are you showing these keys to us? Obviously, after this demonstration, before uploading it to YouTube, I'm going to delete this user with the access key and secret key also, right? So if you see here, these are the best practices that you need to follow. You should never store your access key in a plain text or in a code repository. So you need to disable or delete access key when no longer needed. Enable least privilege permissions. Rotate access key regularly. It is recommended to rotate your keys every 30 days or 60 days or 90 days. Usually in organizations, they rotate the keys every 30 days. It is automatic, right? So you can get to that later. But one more thing, if you lose or forget to forget your secret keys, you cannot retrieve it. Instead, you can create a new access key and make the old key inactive, right? So let me copy this access key with me. I'll store it in a notepad. So it is not recommended to do this, but I'm doing it as it is a demonstration. Okay, so I'll also copy the secret key and I'll paste it here. So these are my access key and this is my secret key. Now what you should do is you should open up your CMD. Okay, I'll just say CMD here and I'll open that in here. Okay, so if you see here, I have opened my command prompt in my laptop. I'll just say CLS and I'll zoom in a bit. Okay, now what you need to do is you need to install something called as AWS CLI. If you do not know how to do that, go ahead and just type in AWS CLI installation guide. Okay, so if you are using Windows, you can go with Windows, and there is a separate documentation for that. You just have to run 2 or 3 commands, then you would be having your CLI installed. I have my AWS CLI installed on my machine, so I can use it right now. Okay, now let's configure our AWS after installing. Okay, so what you need to do is you can just type in AWS configure. Right, so after you type in AWS configure, sorry, it should be, I think, AWS configure. I made a typo here. Configure, right? If you hit enter, it will ask you for some details. You should provide that details. It is asking for AWS access key ID. So you have that copied here. Let me copy once again from my notepad and I'll paste it here. Okay, you need to paste it. Okay, I don't think it is copying here. Let me try to do that again. But you should be able to paste it here without any issues, just like this. Okay, so hit enter, hit enter, hit enter. So now you are able to access your AWS CLI. Let's test that out. Okay, if you see here, AWS error, the following arguments are required. That means you need to give some commands, sub commands with this AWS S3, AWS IAM list users. Those things you can mention and you can get that configured. But be sure not to share these details with anyone in your friend circle or anything. Okay, so that's it I had. So this is how you can configure AWS IAM user to work programmatically. All right, so now next in the coming lecture we are going to discuss about IAM groups. All right, now let's talk about IAM user groups. Okay, so AWS IAM user groups are collection of IAM users that share the same permissions. Okay, so by creating IAM groups, you can simplify the access management, and it makes it easier to manage permissions for a set of users with a similar requirements. Let's say we have 2 people who needs administrator access. So what you can do is, instead of attaching policy to them one by one, you can attach a policy to the group, and if you add those users into that group, so they will inherit the policy which is attached to that group. Okay, so here are some key points that you need to consider while looking through IAM groups. Creating an IAM user groups. How you can do that? You can create an IAM user group by logging into your management console and navigating to IAM management console. You can also use CLI or AWS SDKs to create your IAM groups programmatically. Now, the next thing is IAM group permissions. So before going there, let me go ahead and I'll show you how to create user groups. Okay, let me go to my AWS management console. This is my IAM console here specifically. Okay, now let's go to user groups. So that is what we are discussing in this video. I'll click on user groups here. Here, if you see, I don't have any user group as of now. So what I'll do is I'll click on create group. Okay, so after clicking on create group, it will ask me for the name of the group. What is a group name that you want to give? So I'll say admins. Okay, so basically that means these are my admins of this particular account. So here, after creating the group, providing the name for the user group, what it will ask is you need to provide you need to add the users to that group. So if you already have the users created, you can select them by checking this box. Let's say a Monkey Cloud, and I also want to add Dushyant. So I'll select those two users and they would be part of this group called admins. Okay, so this is IAM user adding users to the group. Now if you see here, attach permissions policies. So what do you mean by that? Let me go back to my documentation here. If you see here under permissions, so permissions can be granted to IAM groups using IAM policies, which are set of permissions that define what actions the group can perform on what resource. So we'll be speaking about this permissions or IAM policies in a while, but now try to understand that if you are attaching a policy to that particular IAM group, that means you are specifying what permissions that they can do. Okay, so you are specifying the permissions for them. Now, so here we already saw what are IAM user group users. Basically, the IAM users can be added into IAM groups, and the permissions granted to the group automatically apply to the users present inside that group. So users can belong to multiple groups, and the permissions granted to those groups are cumulative. That means one user can be part of multiple groups. Let's say Yashwant can be part of admins. He can also be a developer. So let's say I have two groups called admins and developers. So Yashwant can be part of both admins and developers, and he would get the permissions granted to those two groups. Okay, so that is what the meaning of the third one here. Next is IAM group management. You can manage IAM groups by adding or removing IAM users and by modifying the permissions granted to that group. So basically what we are saying here is you can add and remove users at whatever time you want. So let's say tomorrow Dushyant is no longer belongs to our organization. So what you can do is you can come here and you can remove Dushyant from the users and also from the group. So then what happens, Dushyant will not be able to access the AWS management console. Let me go back to the documentation. Now here if you see IAM group best practices. So the best practices for using IAM groups include creating groups that reflect job functions or business purposes and assigning permissions based on least privilege. Let's say Dushyant only wants access to a specific resource, for example EC2 instance. He just wants to look or how many EC2 instances are present in my AWS account. That is his job. So I just want to give him a read permission so that he can go to my management console and see what are the EC2 instances that are running. So I don't have to give him create permissions or delete permissions. He should not be able to delete an EC2 instance or create a new EC2 instance. He should only list the EC2 instance present in my particular account. So if that is required, I need to provide him those suitable permissions only. So that is called as principle of least privilege. You need to make sure that you're providing those permissions. And so reflecting your job functions or business purposes, you need to provide or you need to create a IAM group. Okay, so that is another point. So by using IAM groups, you can simplify access management and make it easier to manage permissions for a set of users with similar requirements. IAM groups can be used in combination with IAM roles and policies to provide a granular and secure way to control access to your AWS resources. Okay, so we can create a maximum of 300 groups in our AWS account, and IAM user can be a member of 10 groups at the same time. Okay, so that's it I had for IAM groups. Next, we'll look at what is IAM role and how to create an IAM role. Okay. All right. Now let's talk about IAM roles. So IAM roles are a way to grant temporary permissions to access AWS resources to trusted users or services. IAM roles enable you to define a set of permissions that determine what actions a user or service can perform on specific AWS resources. Here are some of the key points that I've identified for your IAM roles. Okay, so creating an IAM role, anyway, I'm going to show that in the AWS Management Console. Wait for that. Okay, so you can see what is important here. You can create an IAM role by logging into Management Console, or you can also do that by using AWS CLI and other SDKs. So for example, Bodo3 scripts, right? Now let me jump on to my AWS Management Console. This is my console here. And in my identity and access management, under the left hand side, you can see something called as roles under users. We talked about users, we talked about user groups. Now it's time to explore roles. Let me click on roles here. I have quite a lot of roles that are already created in my AWS account. If you see here, I have around 16 roles created. Okay, so here if you see here, an IAM role is an identity you can create that has specific permissions with credentials that are valid for short durations. So these if you grant an IAM role, so that if you create an IAM role, you will have access for a very short duration, whereas users will have set of long duration of access. Okay, but roles, the access would be for only short duration. Okay, now let's go ahead and explore how to create a role. To do that, let me click on create role. After clicking on create role, it will take you to the page where you need to provide the details. So what are the trusted entities that you are using here? Whether you are using the SAML, AWS supports SAML 2.0 federation, are you using it for another AWS account or web identity or custom trust policy, or whether it is an AWS service itself. Let's say AWS EC2 instance wants to access your S3 on behalf of you. So what you can do is you can select or you can create a role for your EC2 instance, providing the permissions to your S3 bucket, right? So that you can do it here. Okay, now let me select AWS service, and under that I'll select EC2. Okay, so I'll click on EC2. And next, if you click on next here, there are multiple services that AWS offers. If you want to create for others, you can do that, right? If you want to create your own policy and attach it, that also you can do it. If you click on create policy here, it will take you to the new page and you can create a fine-grained policy for your AWS EC2, or else you can go ahead and add a policy that is already there. For example, I'll just say AWS EC2 S3 access, which was created by me a long time back. Okay, so basically let's see what is this policy is doing. Okay, I will be talking about these policies and how to create them later, but just understand what are the policies that we are getting. So basically I'm giving S3 full access to this particular bucket. So there was a bucket that I created. So basically I'm giving the entire S3 access to this particular AWS S3 bucket. Okay, so that is what it is doing. I'll select the same thing and I'll click on next. And obviously at the end you will just have to click on create. That's all, right? You just need to give a name here, provide a meaningful name, and it is applying for AWS EC2. If you see here the principal, under that you have service, and it is ec2.amazonaws.com, right? If it is a Lambda function, it will be lambda.amazonaws.com. Like that, it will be different for different trusted entities. At the end, after selecting all these things, you can just click on create role. So the role will be created and you can attach this role to your EC2 instance so that it can access that particular S3 bucket, right? So I'm not going to do that. I'm just explaining you or showing you how you can do that. Okay, let me go back to my documentation. Next, IAM role trust policy. We saw this in the console, right? Now it will be more clear for us to understand after looking at the console. An IAM role must have a trust policy that specifies the trusted entities that are allowed to assume the role. For example, in our case, it was AWS EC2. So that was our trusted entity, right? The trusted policy determines who can assume the role under what conditions. Basically, in our case, it was EC2. So under what condition it was, assuming only when it tries to, access that particular S3 bucket that I mentioned, right? So next, IAM role access. To access AWS resources using IAM role, a user or service must first assume that role. For example, if I want to access anything, I want to first assume that role myself and then I would be able to access it. In the same way, now we are attaching that IAM role that I showed you to an EC2 instance. So what needs to happen is that EC2 instance first needs to assume that role and only then it will be able to access the S3 bucket. So this is done by requesting temporary security credentials from the AWS Security Token Service or STS. Okay, once the user or service has assumed the role, they can access the resources and perform actions allowed by the role's permission. So whatever the role permission we have, it would be able to do that. An EC2 instance in our case has got access through S3 full access for that particular bucket only. So that EC2 instance will be able to access that particular S3 bucket. Okay, so now what are the best practices for your IAM role? So the best practices for IAM role include defining roles that are based on job functions or business purposes, using policies that grant a least privilege access, and regularly reviewing and updating role permissions, right? So if in case you have granted full access in the beginning just to understand what and all resources it is using, later on if you think that delete is not required for that role, you can go ahead and modify that role. So that is one of the best practice. By using IAM roles, you can grant temporary permissions to access AWS resources to trusted users or services. IAM roles provide a granular and secure way to control access to your AWS resources, and they can be used in combination with IAM policies and groups to manage access at scale. IAM roles are commonly used with services like EC2 instances, Lambda functions, and S3 buckets to provide secure access to AWS resources. Okay, each role can have up to 10 policies attached. Okay, a single role can have at least 10 policies attached. So you can have up to 10 policies for each role. So the maximum roles that you can create in an AWS account would be 1,000, right? So you can create 1,000 roles in an AWS account. Next, in the next video, we are going to talk about AWS policies. So what are policies, how to create them, and we'll also see what is the policy structure, which is very important going forward as a cloud engineer. Okay. All right, now let's discuss a very important topic under IAM, that is IAM policy. In the context of AWS IAM, an AWS policy is a document that defines permissions for an IAM identity. So an IAM identity can be a user, a role, or a group, right? So, or it can be an AWS resource also. Policies are used to grant or deny access to specific actions and resources in AWS services. And here are some key points that you need to know. Okay, first we'll talk about policy structure later. Okay, so it has got a structure for in itself. AWS policies are structured JSON documents that define a set of permissions for one or more IAM identities or AWS resources. A policy consists of one or more statements. Each statement can define a single permission. We'll speak about that in a while. Next is policy scope. So policies can be attached to IAM users, groups, roles, and also other AWS resources. When a policy is attached to an identity or a resource, it defines the actions that the identity or resource is allowed to perform on specified resources. Okay, and also policy syntax. We have a syntax for that. We'll see in a while, so don't worry as of now. Now let's talk about the policy versions. AWS policies can have multiple versions, which allows you to update policies over time while maintaining the ability to roll back to a previous version if needed. Now let's talk about the policy best practices. Best practices for using AWS policies include granting the least privilege access, okay, using conditions to further restrict access, and regularly reviewing and updating policies to ensure that they are still relevant. AWS policies are a powerful tool for controlling access to AWS resources. By using policies, you can grant permissions to specific actions and resources on an as needed basis, right? Which helps you to ensure the security and integrity of your AWS environment. Policies can be used in combinations with IAM roles and groups to provide a granular and secure way to control access to your AWS resources. Okay, an example policy would look like this. It has got a version, it has got a statement and all those things. We'll go one by one. Let's consider version. What is a version? If you see here, it is a JSON document, right? Let's see what is a version. Policy allows the user to perform three actions. One, this policy, the particular one that you are seeing, it is allowing the user to perform three actions, that is list, get, and put on an AWS S3 bucket named example bucket. The policy is structured as follows. First, it contains version, which means this specifies the policy language version, which always set to 2012 1017. It should always be this one, the version. Okay, next is statement. Let's see what is statement. So this is an array of one or more statements that define the access control rules. Basically, these are set of rules that you can add. Okay, next is SID, that means statement ID. This is an optional identifier for a statement. It is optional. You can provide it, or you can also remove that. That is not an issue. Next, effect, whether you are allowing or denying. So let's see what it is mentioned here. This specifies whether the statement allows or denies access to a resource. In our case, it is set to allow. That means it is allowing. Next, action. Let's see what we have for action. So this specifies the action or actions that are allowed or denied. In this case, it allows the actions S3 list bucket, S3 get object, and S3 put object. So it is allowing these three actions. Okay, if you see here, the effect is allow. If it is denied, it is going to deny these three actions. But as it is allowed, it is allowing these three actions on these resources. So what is the resource here? It is an S3 bucket. So let's see what is here in resource. Basically, a resource, this specifies the resource or resources that the action apply to, where action can apply to. So in this case, it allows access to S3 bucket, as example bucket, and all the objects within that bucket. right? This policy is an example of a simple S3 bucket access policy that grants user a permission to perform certain actions on the bucket. Other policies can be more complex and grant different permissions for different resources or conditions. Okay, let's go to AWS IAM console and see what are policies here. Okay, this is my IAM management console, and if you come here down till policies, you see a lot of policies that are already created. So we have one AWS management, AWS managed policies. That means these are already created by AWS. Okay, so they have created these policies for you to use. Okay, and you also can create your own policies like I have done here. I have created many policies here. So these are the policies that I have created. If you see here, they have mentioned that as customer managed. That means I am the one who created this and I need to manage these policies. Okay, let me open one policies that I have created. For example, AWS EC2 S3 access. If you open this one, if you see, these are the things that I have granted access. Okay, and if you open one of the AWS managed policy, let me open this direct connect read access only. So if you see, this is the statement and these are the this statement, the structure of this policy will be in line with whatever we have seen in this one, right? So a policy should contains all these details. SID is optional. Okay, so if you want to create a policy, right, what you can do is you can go all the way up, click on policy. You can use a visual editor here. So they are going to provide an editor which will make your job easy, or else you can paste the JSON document directly here. Okay, so if you are good enough in writing policies, you can directly write it in JSON format, or if you want to use a visual editor, you can do that here. For example, let us create the same policy here. So you can select the we are dealing with S3, so I'll just type in S3 here. Okay, I'll select that S3 object and whatever the actions that you want. For example, I'm going to give S3 list bucket, and also I will give you S3 read actions. Okay, I'll just say get bucket. Do you see get bucket here anywhere? So you can specify. There are, if you see here, get bucket is there. You can add the different actions that you want for your policy. Okay, based on that, it is going to create a policy for you, and you can attach that policy to an AWS identity, can be an user group or a role. Okay, so this is how you create policy in AWS IAM. I hope this is clear for you. All right, now let's talk about identity provider, AWS Identity Provider. An AWS IDP is a service that enables you to use an external identity management system to authenticate users and provide them with access to AWS resources. With an identity provider, you can allow users to sign in with their existing credentials rather than creating a new AWS specific credentials. Okay, let's say you are an organization which was having Azure Active Directory already. Okay, let's assume that. Now you have started using AWS. So your users are already there in Azure Active Directory. So what you can do is, instead of creating new users, new set of users or roles in your AWS account, what you can do is you can use the users that you're already having in Azure Active Directory, create a group, right? And add that particular thing as an identity provider to your AWS account. So I have already set this up in my account. Okay, so just to test this out, I had already tried it. Okay, I have my Azure Active Directory account and I have integrated that as an identity provider for my AWS account also. Okay, here are some key points that you need to know before delving more into AWS identity providers. Okay, so the supported identity providers are AWS supports several popular identity providers, including Amazon Cognito. So this is a AWS proprietary service, Microsoft Active Directory, you can go with Okta and others, right? So how authentication actually happens? When a user attempts to access an AWS account or a resource, they are redirected to their identity provider's login page. So they need to enter their credentials, and then the identity provider then authenticates the user and returns an access token to AWS, right? So that is used to grant access to the requested resource. So this is how it works. Next, what is identity federation? An identity provider can be used to enable identity federation, which allows you to grant temporary access to AWS resources to users who are authenticated by external identity provider. Basically, this allows you to provide access to AWS resources without requiring the users to have an AWS account or credentials, right? That is identity federation. Next, identity provider configuration. So to configure an AWS identity provider, you must first create an identity provider in AWS Management Console and then create an IAM role that allows users authenticated by the identity provider to assume the role and access AWS resources. So I have already done that in this is my AWS Management Console, and here if you come under identity providers, I have something called as Azure AD added already. Okay, so if you want to add a new provider, what you need to do is you can click on add, and you can add that as a SAML, and you will get something called as metadata document, and you need to attach that file here. After that, you can able to add the provider. So what I'll do is I'll make a separate video for this one because this is not required for your examination. So this demonstration I'd be doing that in a separate video, and I'll be adding that in the same playlist. Okay, make sure to check that, but it will take some time for me to make a video on that, so please forgive me for that. Next, so what are the best practices? So best practices for using AWS identity providers include ensuring that the identity provider meets your organization's security and compliance requirement, regularly reviewing and updating identity provider configurations, and using multi-factor authentication to further secure access to your AWS resources. AWS identity providers provide a secure and flexible way to authenticate users and provide them with access to AWS resources. By using an identity provider, you can enable users to sign in with their existing credentials and reduce the number of AWS specific credentials that need to be managed and simplify access to management for your AWS environment. Right? So this is what we had for identity provider. Now let's talk about multi-factor authentication or MFA. So multi-factor authentication can add an extra layer of security to your infrastructure by adding a second method of authentication beyond just a password or access key. With MFA, authentication also requires entering one-time password or OTP from a small device. So you can use an application also. For example, you can use a Google Authenticator, Okta, or any other authenticators, Microsoft Authenticator. So you would need to scan a QR code which will display right there. So after scanning in, you need to enter two codes which you will be receiving on your phone, and after that you will be done, right? One again, whenever you are logging in back to your AWS account, after providing your username password, you also need to enter an one-time password that will be appearing on your phone. Only then you will be able to log in. So basically it is adding an extra layer of security to your infrastructure. Okay, the MFA device can either be a small hardware device you carry with you, for example SafeNet ID proof, 100 OTP token or something like that, or a virtual device via an application that I just explained on your smartphone, right? For example, Google authentication. So this will add you an extra layer of security. So that's it. We need to know about multi-factor authentication here. Let's go back to our AWS management console and see how we can add a multi-factor authentication. Okay, now this is my management console. Let's see how we can add MFA. Okay, you can either directly add it here, but if you need to add a MFA for a particular user, what you can do is you can go to users and let me select Dushyant here, and for him I need to, if I just have to add an MFA, what I need to do is I'll just go to security credential, and here if you see we have something called as multi-factor authentication. Okay, you can just click on assign MFA device, and you need to specify the device name, whether it is going to be your phone or anything. Then if you are using an application, you can specify, or you can scan the QR code. If you are going with the security key, you need to select that one. I don't have any hardware devices, so I'm going with the authenticator app. Let me say test auth. Okay, so I'll just click on next. Here it will show you the QR code. If I just click on this show QR code, you will get a QR code. Meanwhile, you should also download the application, whether it can be a Google Authenticator, Duo Mobile, or Authy app. After downloading, if you click on the show QR code, a QR code will be displayed. Opening that application, Google Authenticator, you need to scan the QR code. After scanning, you will start receiving the code. You need to enter the first two codes that you will get, and if you just click on add MFA, your MFA will be added to that particular user. Whenever the person needs to log in again, he needs to add the MFA code, and only then you will be able to access your AWS management console. Okay, so that's it. I had to discuss about multi-factor authentication in this part. Okay. Okay, now let's discuss about password policy. An AWS password policy is a set of rules that specify the requirements for user passwords in AWS account. Password policies are used to enforce strong password security and help prevent unauthorized access to AWS resources. And these are some key points that you need to know. First one, password requirements. Okay, an AWS password policy specifies the minimum and maximum length of passwords as well as requirements for password complexity, including the use of uppercase, lowercase letters, numbers, and alphanumeric characters or special characters. Right. Next is password expiration. So a password policy can also specify how often users must change their passwords and how long a password can be used before it must be changed. Next, account lockout. A password policy can specify how many failed login attempts will result in an account being locked out and for how long, right? Next is password policy enforcement. Password policies are enforced by AWS IAM, which checks the password of each user against the policy requirements at the time the password is set or changed. Next, what are the best practices? So it includes setting strong password requirements, regularly reviewing and updating password policies, and providing user education and training on password security best practices. AWS password policies are an important security feature that helps prevent unauthorized access to AWS resources, right? By enforcing strong password security, you can help to ensure the security and integrity of your AWS environment. It's important to regularly review and update your password policies and to provide user education and training on password security best practices to further enhance your security posture. Okay, let me go back to my management console. If you ask me where can I get the details about this, you need to go into account settings. Here you will see something called as password policy. Okay, here you need to review this password policy. If you feel that this is not sufficient, you can edit it always and increase it further. For example, password minimum length we have set to 8. So if you want to edit it to 12, you can just click on edit and increase the characters here. And if you have any other requirements, you can specify that. For example, I have specified never expire password. That means you can use the password as long as you want, right? But if you want to enforce password expiration to 30 days, after 30 days, let's say if the user is the user needs to reset their password, right? So those things you can add it here. Okay, so that is about password policy. Now let's talk about credential report. An AWS credential report is a detailed report that provides information about the status of AWS credentials in an AWS account. The report contains information on IAM users, access keys, passwords, and other security related information. Okay, here are some key points that you need to know. Report content. The report includes information about IAM users, access keys, password status, and password last use time. It also includes information on service linked roles, MFA status, and other security related information. Access and format. So credential reports can be accessed through the AWS Management Console or CLI and can also be downloaded in either CSV or JSON format. So what are the use cases of this credential report? Credential reports can be used to monitor the security status of your AWS environment, identify security vulnerabilities and compliance issues, and track the issues or usage of IAM users and access keys. Next is report scheduling. You can schedule the automatic generation of credential report on a daily or weekly basis and specify a preferred delivery method for the report. Best practices that you need to follow includes reviewing the report regularly to identify security issues, disabling unused or unnecessary access keys, and regularly rotating access keys and password to ensure the security. AWS credential reports are an important security tool that provides valuable information about the status of AWS credential in your account. By regularly viewing and analyzing the report, you can identify and address potential security vulnerabilities and ensure the ongoing security and integrity of your AWS environment. Now let's see how we can download this AWS credential report. To that, you need to log into your AWS Management Console and open IAM Management Console. And here in the left hand side, you have something called as Credential Report. If you click on that, you would be having a button called Download Credential Reports. You can download that and analyze the data. The credential report lists all your IAM users in this account and the status of their various credentials which they are using, whether it can be an access key, secret key, MFA, all those details will be there in that report. After the report is created, it is stored for up to 4 hours. Right? So now let's see, I've already downloaded this report and I have removed some important things from that report, and this is how the report looks. Basically, your users will be mentioned here and the user ARNs will be here. Creation time, when was the user created, whether they are using the password or not, when they use the password for the last time, when did they change the password. If you have set some rules like if they want to rotate the password, when it is going to happen, whether MFA is active or not, whether they are using access key, right? They can create two access keys for one user. So whether the first access key is active or not, when was it last rotated, when the access keys were rotated, and what was the last use date for that, all the details you will see in this report. So these are the different things that you will be getting in your credential report. Okay, I've removed all the details here for my account, so that for the security reasons you can download and analyze your account's detail here. Okay, so that's it for credential report. Now, after completing the IAM, let's discuss some points to remember as a summary. Okay, so first point is IAM is universal and it does not apply to any regions. The meaning is IAM is a global service. If you see here, it is mentioned as global, and if you store the credential or if you are using IAM, that means it is a global, which remains same for all the different regions that you have. But if you go with other resources, for example, EC2, it is a regional service. That means every region, the EC2 instances will be different, right? So, but here IAM, it is a global service. Next, the root account is simply the account created when you first set up your AWS account, and it has got complete admin access. Okay, so that is our second point. Next, new users have no permissions when they first created. If you just create a user without attaching any policy, that users cannot do anything in your AWS account. They do not have any permissions to act on, right? So that is your third point. Fourth, new users are assigned to access key ID and secret keys ID when first created. Okay, so there are not the same password, and you cannot use the access key and secret key to log into your console. You can use this to access AWS via API and command line. I've shared this how to do that in a video, right? So you only get to view these ones, right? If you lose them, you have to regenerate them. So save them in a secure location and do not share it with any other people. Always set up multi-factor authentication on your root account. You can create and customize your password rotation policy, right? So that is it for the masterclass on IAM. So everything that is needed for you to cover AWS IAM service. Okay, so I hope you're liking the content that I'm creating. If you're liking the content, please consider subscribing and share it among your friends. Thank you, and I will see you in the next masterclass.